Hello, everyone, and welcome to Citizen Bear. This is a podcast talking about my book, The Demonstrative Citizen, The Revelation of Two Dragons. We take some time to talk about some of the many layers and issues that go on in the book, the topics, and it's try to relate them to some current events. While the book was meant to be a forward-looking kind of dystopian look, a good yarn with a lot of different layers and meanings, the characters are wonderful. But I think it was something that was meant to look at the society and be a bit of a warning, too, a discussion about things and who we are and what we're about, really our founding principles, and retouching them in a dystopian time. And unfortunately, some of those things have become a little more real and a little more topical today. So I thought it'd be fun to do this podcast and talk about those things. And we'll see where the podcast evolves beyond that. But we really have talked about a bunch of different things. And today we're going to get into a topic talking about economics. And we're going to call this segment Follow the Money. And I think it's an important one with everything going on in our world, with a country that's $37 trillion in debt. And we're talking about inflationary issues, and we're always kind of, a lot of things don't always tend to make sense. I think it's important to kind of start at the beginning and maybe talk about a few of these things and maybe put some fresh perspective on it, on how we got from, point A to point B, maybe point C at this point. Before we get started, though, on the economic issues or following the money, if you will, I really want to just quickly talk on something that I've harped on before in different segments. And I just want to take a brief segment here and just go back on a topic where I really am just kind of appalled. And this is in response. I'm talking about, New York Governor Hochul and New York City Mayor Adams. And now we've got a candidate for Florida governor, a Democratic candidate for Florida governor shooting off. And then people are talking, the mayor and the governor are acting in response to a shooting, a very tragic shooting. It is appalling. But I don't want to get into that per se. I'm not going to, take a lot of time on that. But what I'm really called about is the immediate response on this is to call for sweeping national gun control and really the elimination of pretty much all gun rights. That's what they're talking about ultimately. I mean, I can't quite understand whether they're talking about AR platforms, all semi-automatics, or all guns, because it's just not really clear to me. But when you get done with it with this initiative, they're talking about all guns. And this candidate for governor of Florida is talking about just directly taking on the Second Amendment. And I think we need to be, I've talked about this at length, and I'm not going to go back into it. But I'm just disgusted with blaming the gun, and I'm disgusted with the topic. We have to start looking at some of these failed policies, and we have to talk about failed leadership. I mean, a guy walked down the street with a long gun next to him in a city that has basically a gun ban in it, and no one did anything. No one seemed to pick up on this. I mean, I'm a little shocked. We've got National Guard troops in the subways. At some point, we have to say that there's a problem of leadership, not the gun. But I think that there are other problems in New York City. And it was a great city once, just like San Francisco and others, all under Democratic leadership and all being flushed down the toilet. And I think that we have to seriously stop and take a moment. In a world that is on the brink of war, external war, and some internal strife as a result of that external war, to call for the disarmament of the American people, to call for the disarmament of the great American militia, as I called in the book, in my opinion, amounts to nothing less than treason. And to call for the absolute attack and assault on the Second Amendment based on ideological preferences, without following the constitutional process and without being able to. They wish to override the will of the people and put their ideological claims because they know better. They want to eliminate the Second Amendment fundamentally or change it by fiat, not by constitutional process, not by the desire of the American people. And that amounts to nothing more than outright insurrection in our nation. And we have to call it what it is. These people need to be slammed down and voted out of office. And unfortunately, in their states, they may not be. But nationwide, we have to see them for what they are. That's kind of my final word on the topic. Now, let's take a minute. You're going to see me laugh a little bit in some of this, but it's probably just because I don't want to cry. And we're going to talk about the U.S. economy, and we're going to talk about world economy, and we're going to talk about the money. And this is a broad overview, okay? So we're not going to do too deep a dive, but I think for some people out there who don't really think about this and never really had an interest in it, it might be a quick study on it and the cliff notes, if you will. And it might give some insights on things, especially maybe for some younger people out there. But also, I think there's just a lot of Americans who've gotten caught in day-to-day life, and there's so much noise that it's hard to really get your head around anything anymore. So first, let me just put out there, we're going to talk about a little history on this and go back a little bit to lay some foundation. But it's important to keep in mind that the United States economy and the United States economy in the world is the most robust and most complicated economy I think the world has ever seen. And it is a powerful, still a powerful, powerful machine out there, even though it's evolved and changed, and it has become very much effectuates the world in a lot of ways. It is a powerful, powerful engine still. And it is a complicated engine with many pressure points. And we're not going to go way deep down in the weeds to talk about all those pressure points. We're going to talk about just some cause and effect and some basics here that kind of give an overarching view of how we got to where we are and some of the things that are going on and maybe some of the concerns. And we're going to take a step from pure fact or, talk about some of the realities to go into a little bit more speculation and a little bit of you can reach your own conclusions. I'll give you mine. First looking back, a lot of people would talk about the U.S. economy and the modern order, the global order of things as the post-World War II order. And it's true. The United States post-World War II was really the last economic platform, industrial platform in the world. And most of the world had been laid to ruin. Europe was bombed into nothing. Russia had been badly harmed. Asia was in terrible shape. Japan had been hurt desperately. China was in ruin from the Japanese invasion, and a lot of smaller countries had been affected. So there was no one really left to rebuild the world except the United States. And we had a vast and incredibly mighty industrial base. This is the sleeping giant that was talked about in World War II. Yamamoto talked about awakening this great sleeping giant. Yes, the American people, the American spirit, but this great economic and industrial engine that was going to, they were going to have to face was going to come to life against them. And it did. And we have to see that post-World War II, we began the process through a lot of different procedures, policies, the Marshall Plan and other things. We began to rebuild the world. Not alone, but we were very, very prominent in starting to rebuild the world. And we did it with ally and enemy alike. Everybody became a new ally. We began a new order in things. And we began to rebuild the world in that model of free republics, free society, free republics. The republic became the dominant creature. Like America is a constitutional republic, there are different forms of that constitutional republic, but most of these countries that grew up around it and are what we refer to as the free world are republics like America. And when they saw the benefit of the republic and this plan began to do, a lot of them picked up parliamentary systems and not a Jeffersonian democracy, but they moved forward as a free society. And they began to industrialize and they began to join in this. In keeping with that, the United States set itself up because it was an unparalleled economic power and an unparalleled military power. The United States became the backbone of this growing and emerging order. And eventually it's set up as the index currency for that order. The greenback became the way you did business. And we became referred to as the index currency. Because if you want to, for instance, buy oil and other things, you trade your money into dollars. So you're indexed against the dollar. So whatever it's worth, and you can cost more or less, but you buy in dollars and everything is done. Big trades on the global marketplace are done in dollars. It was all set out as a program to protect, as a shield for the global economy, to make sure that the good faith and credit of the United States of America would back those greenbacks, those dollars, and that your trades were good. So in essence, we were really guaranteeing global trade in a manner of speaking. And through, the late 40s, the 50s, the 60s, we were the guarantors of that. And we still are, but in a very specific way as the world was rebuilding and there were a lot of instability, we gave stability to that system as it began to grow. I think one of the things that you should understand is when we talk about the good faith and credit of the United States of America, that is not some magical term that the government is going to make good on. Yes, the government is the guarantor. They sign the notes, they issue the money and stuff like that, okay? So the United States government does that. But the true good faith and credit of the United States government is you. You're the bank. And I want you to keep that thought as we go through the rest of this. It is you, because the government's ability to tax on gross national product, your income, and also the wealth of this nation to pull in funds for the wealth of this nation, gave it this huge power out there because it was such an immense economy compared to the rest of the world. And we were able to do that. But you are the guarantor. Make no question. You're the bank. You can talk about the Federal Reserve. You can talk about a lot of other things out there. You can talk about issuing bonds and all this other stuff. But the truth of the matter is, it is the good faith and credit of the United States of America comes down to, in the end, the American people and their wealth. Hold that thought. Also, an important part of this is this time at the end of the war, China was a closed country. They had fought a civil war, and the nationalists had lost and taken over Taiwan, and they sat there. That's why you have this issue. And that's how Taiwan was formed. And the communists won that civil war, and communist China was emerged. And they really closed themselves off for the most part from the world. It wasn't until the early 70s that under Richard Nixon that China began to open up to the rest of the world. And it was something of a kind of a North Korea, if you will. I hate to say it, but it was kind of a, this closed world in society where they were trying to build nuclear weapons and drawing things on ox carts. It was kind of this mixed bag, and it was very much, going through this indoctrination process and cultural change into this communist model. And make no question, millions died, millions were tortured, millions suffered under this until they got it, until they sculpted this into the model or the statue that they wanted. So it started to emerge as an economy and a potential, partner in the world and as a communist government, and was beginning to come into the world, open up to U.S. Partnerships or supply and demand and other things, products, and in the early 70s. And hopefully, I think there was some plan with that the United States would, that China would emerge and change, and become part of the, free market and then part of the free world. I think that was a little hopeful, Now, it's also important about in 1933, because of the Depression and because of the pending war, the United States was temporarily taken off the gold standard. And there was a whole thing about gold with then you couldn't even own it. It got pulled back because they didn't want gold affecting the value of the dollar. But the United States didn't come off the gold standard, in other words, gold backing the United States dollar, until 1971. And there's an important reason for this, is because the gold standard became more restrictive to the dollar as the index currency than it was helpful. You could only print so much money, and I know people will debate other reasons, but for me, this is the principal reason we pulled off the gold standard, was because we no longer could be restricted by the value of gold. If you have $1 billion in gold assuring your money, you can only have $1 billion in greenbacks out. We needed more, so we needed the ability to print money as the standard, as the gold, as the index currency. And we did that, and we came off the gold standard. What the result of that is the ability to print money and not be linked to gold allowed us to um, give liquidity to the global markets, but it also allowed us to, it also, well, I shouldn't say allowed, it started a process of spiraling inflation. So, but it was slow and it was paced. And as long as we managed that upward spiraling inflation, it had its drawbacks, but it wasn't all bad. We got into a situation where, about we've seen this over 7, 8 years, we have a small recession, we kind of, everything resets. And you have to kind of take the definition, and this is a kind of a supply-demand recession idea, but the thumbnail term used for that is too many dollars chasing too few goods. So this is what happens when you print money. There are too many dollars out there all of a sudden. And then what happens is there's not enough goods and services and prices to keep up with it. So you kind of stumble and we get into a recessionary period. What ends up happening is you really get a reset. And more goods, more services come out over time, and you end up inflating the economy and inflating the world. Well, people match that. Well, if, you need more goods and services, I'll sell you something. That's kind of that's capitalism at its best. And we get out there and people raise prices, other things, and so the economy gets back on track. People see new opportunities. The money is put into new things, and we start moving forward. And as long as we manage these cycles, it really wasn't a bad thing. In many ways, while people got hurt in the short term because of changes in jobs and economics, we managed it pretty well. And it can be a good thing because the economy got inflated. And as long as we had some social programs and nets for people who got caught in these recessionary moments, it was, we move forward. And there was a greater good in it. And the global economy, because of the liquidity added to the marketplace by the United States and the strength of the continuing strength of that economy, the index currency acted as a shield for the global economy and a source for strength. Once you got down the road on this, all of this was baked in. So I want to give you kind of a final point. And this is because we're just in the early stage of this conversation, so I want to give you a quick point here. And I want you to hold this thought. Economics 101, and again, it's a broad brush, but Economics 101. Trade deficits are offset with budget deficits. So as we're looking at our world right now, keep that in mind, and as we get a little further down the road, let that stew for a minute when we're also talking about this inflationary thing and getting money out there. So kind of going down the road, getting out of some of that historical background, we were moving forward, but the whole process, I think, suffered from one ironic problem. It was too successful. I mean, make no question. The post-World War II economic structure was beyond brilliant. It is the greatest economic system ever conceived, and it has done so much good in the world. We have lifted so many people from poverty. So many nations have flourished. Not just flourished, but reached a point of beyond flourishing where their wealth is they've become very comfortable, almost too comfortable. And they are, building coffee shops and relaxing and taking extra days off and slowing the work week down. And my God, you know what I mean? Life's worth living here, We've done a lot of good in the world, and really, the amount of prosperity that has been brought to the world by this economic engine is just unprecedented. People talk about things. Let me tell you, there ain't nobody getting in an old rickety lifeboat overloaded with people fleeing the free world. They're fleeing communism. They fled Castro. They fled all these other places, They ain't fleeing places that have been lifted up by this economic system. And when we open doors into countries and use and bring them into this economic system, they help strengthen the system with new markets, new people, and we help them. And it's really, really been an amazing study, but it's been very successful. And in keeping with that, as it grows, there's a couple of things to consider. One is the fact that in this prosperity, we industrialized much of the world. And we got a lot of industrialization out there. So we had competition. We offshored with other companies. Steel. We don't make as much steel in the United States. There was a time U.S. Steel, American Steel, I should say, because there was a U.S. Steel company. American Steel, which was principally U.S. Steel, was the gold standard of the world. Aluminum, Alcoa, all these things, just, phenomenal. But we started pushing that to other countries. Other companies were manufacturing it. And we took a lot of manufacturing off the robustness of our manufacturing, and we spread it globally. And the investments we made in other countries, the investment countries made in themselves through this system paid off. They did great, and they're manufacturing all kinds of things. We also decided in the midst of that in this country to become much more technologically oriented. We went with the technological invention. We were willing to give up manufacturing steel for the fact that we would create a much more technological world, and we would control the intellectual property out there. And it's not universally true, but we still drive a great deal of that. And if you look at things, everything from the internet, the personal computer, and all kinds of things, we still do a lot with that. It's not that there aren't a lot of very smart people in other countries in the world, because there are, and they're starting to put a lot of great products out there. But that's part of this global community, global economy that we are, building and being part of. And all this is incredibly healthy. But it also takes a very strong index currency to press it. And so we have to continue to keep liquidity in the marketplace. We have to continue to keep the dollar out there. And so as that marketplace has grown, we have had to put more money out there. And you get into things like the banking crisis of 2008. Of course, we had to just pour liquidity into it because of bad practices, if you will. It allowed it to happen, but I think it was a little more complicated than that. It was really bad practices that kind of exposed the fact that there wasn't enough liquidity. I think when we started this, all of this became a demand on the American society, and we began actually importing more goods and putting more dollars out there. And then, when you start printing money, you got to spend it, right? So we started putting more and more money out there into circulation. And I think this is where we started to get into a little bit more problematic issues for the U.S. Remember now, in this time, it was in the 90s under the Clinton administration, that China wasn't just open to trade. We brought China as a favored nation, gave them favored trading status. And we really opened them up to be a workforce for the United States, the idea being that cheaper goods could be made there and they would be imported here. Well, and this is all part of a gaming theory, that kind of gaming theory idea where if everybody's playing ball together, if we all sacrifice a little bit, we all make out better, and everybody's happy and everybody has skin in the game and trade. There's no reason for wars or anything else. We kind of work this out. The problem with that is that amongst free societies, that can be true. Not universally true, but it has some limitations. Well, of course, everybody has their own interests, but it is universally true. The problem is when you start dealing with authoritarian countries with communist mindset and different ambitions, which now include China, Russia. Unfortunately, Russia became a authoritarian state. It is. And we look at Iran, another major authoritarian player, dealing from a religious ideological view, but it's an authoritarian state. It hides behind this thin veil of democratic process, but it's an authoritarian state, make no question. So those three countries should sound familiar from other things we've talked about. Did we really believe that they were going to have the same ideas? They can talk the same process. They can take advantage of the process for their own benefit, but they were never going to have the same goals we were going to have. And in there lies a real rub in all this. And we have to keep that in the back of our heads as well as we start to move forward with some of this, that, we were somewheres in this process bringing other countries in and new markets and lifting up the whole world, we were printing more and more and more money. So the recessionary cycles got a little closer, and the depth of those recessions became greater. The amplitude of those things became much greater. We had more money in circulation, and then we had deeper recession after so many years. And this cycle started to get a little more extreme in our country as a result of printing more money for this. And I think that's why you're starting to see politicians, businessmen like Donald Trump saying, look, we can still do this, but we need to kind of get on a better playing field here, and we need to get on a more global playing field. And there's a lot to be considered and a lot to be talked about, but that's not the point of this discussion. The problem with it is as we began to build our trade deficit with bringing more goods in, cheap goods in from China, and I think you can watch the national deficit balloon after that China preferred nation status. We had them begin to import more cheaper goods, and they were cheaper on just about every level into this country. We began to work on a trade deficit, on a budget deficit that automatically offset that. And we were printing money to kind of maintain that budget deficit, and we were putting that money out there. And here's where I think some of that really, really went wrong. And I have to emphasize to you, if you want to talk about economics, you can get, a group of people, economists in a room, put a lawyer in charge of them, and none of them will agree on anything, and they'll all have different opinions. And what you call that is the Fed. And unfortunately, that's what the Federal Reserve has become. It's kind of a backward-looking, Mother May I, is it all right to do this kind of organization who's become a debating society about what's happened in the past. And I think it needs a little fresh blood on the fact that we need some business people in there who are a little more gunslinger-oriented and look forward and say, nope, doesn't matter. Don't worry about the wrong or right. You need to draw the gun and shoot. That's it. You know what I mean? Because that's what the situation calls for. And I think we got to get a little fresh blood in there. We got to start being a little more forward-looking, but that's just a personal opinion. And I'm not going to get into the whole Fed thing right now because the Federal Reserve is part of this, but maybe we'll pick that up in a different topic at a different time. In this process, as we saw the trade deficit begin to balloon, as we offshored a lot of stuff, and we began to, especially with the Chinese market, we started to have them manufacturing, and then what they were really exporting was cheap labor at the time. It was a huge boondoggle for the Chinese. There was a huge influx of capital into China, which communism lives on. All of these isms, fascism, socialism, communism. Don't let anyone ever fool you that capitalism is bad because it uses capital in it. It's the bad thing. Let me tell you, the greatest demand or the greatest ideology that requires capital is socialism, communism, fascism, authoritarian figures. They are black holes for capital, and their economies required. And it's one reason that they always collapse or they're always at war is because they have to pursue that capital. I'm sorry, if we look back in history, you can see this time and time again. It is the fall of the Soviet Union. I'm surprised the Soviet Union lasted as long as it did because in the end, it just needs that capital. And this idea that government is just going to hand things out and partake it really excludes the marginality of goods being moved and finances being moved from one place to another. You never really lose the fact that there is margin in every time you move money and give it to people or trade it, and whatever that system is. People, you got a farmer growing corn. Some point he's going to want a little corn for himself, and communism says, well, I'm going to take all the corn and I'll give you what I think you deserve, and that may be none. That's not going to work. And there's gas involved in moving it and everything. There's a marginality to doing this. You have to bring those goods to market. You have to allocate them out there, and there are costs involved in this. And they never count for that, for those costs and the rising prices and the inflation, if you will. They hide the inflation that's inherent to the system, and it ends up burying them. It's a time bomb, just building and building and building beneath the surface. And eventually that inflation catches up to them to the point that the stores become empty. Don't let these knuckleheads tell you that, we're going to, like in New York City, we're going to have government grocery stores. That's not going to work. The only way it has ever worked is if capitalism outside gives you the capital to have food in those government grocery stores. It's a racket. It's not a solution. But that's just a point for a little bit down the road. One of the things that happened as we began this trade deficit and we began getting into this which was a bad policy, and we started doing this, we began to realize that other people didn't share our values. There was a shocker, and that, they were going to do this. And I have to kind of laugh, because anyone who's read The Three Little Pigs should understand this, right? That the big bad wolf really, no matter what he says or does, his intention is to eat the little pigs, right? We get that. And for some reason, our politicians didn't understand that authoritarian communist governments had one goal, and it was to, kind of consume us. And I don't know why we were empowering them, but that's okay. I'll leave that to other people's judgments. Somewhere in the course of this became a machine. And we began balancing our trade deficit with our budget deficit. We were pouring liquidity into the market. We were spending money, and we were just pouring wealth out. Just pouring wealth out over the last so many decades. 40 years, call it. You can trace it back longer, but let's just call it 40 years. We've been, maybe 50, we've been pouring liquidity into the marketplace. And unfortunately, what was meant to be a shield in the global economy to balance and strengthen the global economy really suddenly became a sword to kill the goose that laid the golden egg. And that's us, by the way. And this is part of this whole change in doctrine. But what's most frightening is that the career politicians that we have allowed to stay into office have written the laws to benefit them, and they have really become addicted to this spending cycle that they have gotten onto. And it is self-enriching. If you ever wondered how a politician who had no money got into office making $190,000 a year and suddenly woke up in about 3-4 years and with tens of millions of dollars in the bank and growing to hundreds of millions of dollars in the bank, well, the answer is because they've got a system that eventually gives them money back from that spending. We literally, and you may not like the term, but it's just the way I see it, is we've legalized racketeering in this country. The politicians have legalized racketeering to their favor. You can spend money. We allocate money to causes, to economic areas, businesses. They get all this money for help developing new products, investing. We talk it up. It's all about, global warming. We're going to have solar power. We got all these investments out there. And then these companies turn around and their CEOs get big bonuses, and all of them invest in the politicians who help them. They give money to their campaigns. They give money to their, what do they call it, political funds, and other things. And what ends up happening is at the end of the day, those funds end up in the politicians' hands. They become, the election's over and the money's left, so I can take the money, right? It becomes mine. And it's a game. It's a racket. They get hired to, go talk at some, corporate meeting for a couple $1 million. I don't know that I'd let these people walk my dog, let alone pay $2 million to listen to what he has to say. But that's, this is what we do. And so these people become incredibly enriched by money that we gave. And we should make no question about something. When you hear people out there, and I saw this out on the internet a little while ago where they were saying, not to worry. The United States has a $70 trillion fund to insure the national debt. No, it doesn't. The U.S. government does not have a piggy bank. They're talking about you. That's your 401k. That's the equity you have in your home. That's your income. That's the property you own, everything. That's your net worth, every single one of you. That's what's insuring that money, nothing else. And they're coming for it. And the people they're stealing from are you and me. And we've all suffered from these cycles. And these cycles are getting harder and more severe. We are exceeding now. Our national debt is at $37 trillion. We have poured liquidity into the system. We have poured liquidity into our marketplace. And don't get me wrong, I'm a big believer in military spending, and I'm a big believer in supporting the technological advancements and supporting the military complex in that regard. I mean, I'm all in. But it's very clear from our society right now, this money has not been invested in our society. It has not benefited us greatly. I mean, you can talk about roads and a few other things, but we've got veterans living in the streets. We got homeless people everywhere. And the more, it seems to me, the more these politicians talk about the aid they're giving and the good they're doing, the more people end up in the streets. I totally don't understand. How can we be $37 trillion in the hole and have people looking for jobs and have people losing their homes? How can that be happening? Because the money isn't going to you. For all they tell you that all these great programs, let me tell you, under Jimmy Carter back in the late 1970s, we started the Department of Education. And I hate to sound political here, but it's a good example. We started the Department of Education. We began to bloat government. And this is part of this spending spree as we begin to bloat government because we need to manage all the programs that we're putting out there, right? We're just more and more people out there, invested in the government. And if we go back to our conversation about Locke and as early as Locke and the founding fathers, big government is the antithesis of free society. It is a crushing blow to free society. That's why we always didn't want big government. But now with all this spending, we have created this monstrous bureaucracy that is out there. And one of those bureaucrats, just as an example, is the Department of Education. In the late 1980s, the Department of Education was formed to be a federal oversight and a federal doler out of bucks for better education in this country. And ever since the Department of Education was founded, test scores and educational scores have gone down. I mean, like off a cliff in this country. So don't tell me that we're really working on programs and that we're doing a better job for our society. We're just pouring money into the teachers' unions and into other investments to, so we can get political clout. We're not really investing in people or in free society. We're investing in big government. And big government just crushes free society. And that is just one bold-faced example of how it does. And I know that the term racketeering sounds a little harsh, but I have to be honest with you. If you and I did this, if we went out in the world and someone trusted me with their money, and I took money in trust, and I went out and gave it to some colleagues of mine to benefit the people who gave it to me, and it didn't benefit them at all, and then they got rich, and I took the money, and they gave me a kickback to make sure that I stayed in my job so I could give them more money, the FBI would be raiding my house. They'd be raiding any of our houses if we did that. And that is exactly what the politicians have written into the law to allow themselves to do. That is legalized racketeering, in my opinion. But okay, people can reach their own conclusions, And I think at the end of the day, we're going to find that that's at the heart of one of the things that has been killing us, that we've not just been spending this money. Putting money, liquidity into the marketplace is a good thing when we're using it as a shield to help the overall marketplace. But putting it into the marketplace to benefit an ideological idea like communism and to promote big government, which is, by the way, kind of a communist thing, right? Or a fascist kind of thing, then we have to really realize that we were never benefiting from this. This was all a scam. And that we didn't really have to run up this national debt because of inflation or managing deficit. This was all contrived. It was all poorly done. You can call it mismanagement. You can call it, destruction of America. You can call it all kinds of things. You can call it, dumb. But over time, there is no doubt about the fact that career politicians in this country, and I think particularly now in the far left, have just become drunken mad on this, and they are moving in a direction, and that direction is a new world order. And that new world order is a global government, a global economy. And I have to tell you, this is meant to cover what I consider to be the greatest bank robbery in the history of the world. And you're the bank. So, it's not funny. They're going to take this. Now, you have to remember, when you're in a communist country, like when the communists took over China, they basically took over everything, right? You didn't have a lot of rights. They took your money, they took your land, they took everything, and all for the good of the state, right? It was to be the state knew better how to manage it than you did. Well, that's not really true, but okay, they went out and did that. But when you talk about this new world order and in moving towards these authoritarian regimes that we see popping up and the influences of authoritarianism around the world, this is where they're heading economically. They're going to handle your finances. They're going to handle your money. They're going to handle you, electronic currency, the whole 9 yards. They're going to own everything in a manner of speaking. They're going to own everything that you think you possess. Equity in a home may be gone. The ability to own land is going to be limited, if not gone. All of these things are a result of big government and moving towards these authoritarian kind of control. And it is what communists have done, is what fascists have done. It is dangerous. It is socialism is the stepping block into it. And you've already heard tones of it out there from some of our great leaders. Be careful. Be careful. This is what they are talking about. And the New World Order will globalize debt, it will globalize all of these things and put it under the World Bank, and everybody will be dealing from the same deck, if you will, and the same level. It sounds kind of nice. And it will be under an authoritarian control. It will be a hybrid of what China is now. A communist country with something of a free market economy. Well, it's not really a free market economy. It's a communist economy. It just benefits from the free market, taps into the free market. And it's not really communism anymore. It's kind of a hybrid of fascism, if you want to know the truth. It's really an oligarchy kind of thing that they're developing into. And I think this is where they're trying to take this new world order and economically. And I think you should be very afraid of that. I think we should all be desperately afraid of it, and afraid of it for our children and our grandchildren. Because in the end, all it's going to do is cover the bank robbery. They're going to move the money into a global thing. They're going to eliminate the debts. They're going to, seize assets and control the finances of people around the world. And all the malfeasance that went on and all the kickbacks will be gone. It'll just be washed away. It is a crime so big, so enormous, that I'm not sure we actually have a definition for it. We've not seen anything like it. And I don't know that we know how to prosecute it. I think the answer is we don't have an ability to prosecute because some of it's been legalized and normalized. And I think the American people are the only people who can come back and say, we're just not going to vote for people to do this anymore. We want this stopped. And we want a new system. And we have to get politicians, probably people who are business-oriented, to go in there and say no more. I don't need the money. Just get on with it. We need to fix this. Because we've become drunk on this spending. And that spending is putting so much equipment out there that we are building an inflationary time bomb. And the Biden administration extended the fuse on that bomb. They kicked the can down the road, but they also doubled the size of the bomb. So we need to make sure that we can diffuse this and get it settled before it blows up in our face, because it could be, it's not going to be, world ending, but it could be very devastating to our society to go through a deep, deep recession like this, another great recession. We just don't need that problem from a huge inflationary thing. And a lot of steps are being taken. I think the Trump administration is trying to do a lot of steps out there right now to fix this on a global level, but this needs to start effectuating Main Street, because it's doing a lot for Wall Street, but I think it needs to effectuate Main Street, because Main Street, I believe, is starting to run head on into this inflationary problem that occurred under the Biden administration from all this spending and their overwhelming spending and overwhelming desire to cut back on other products and things. So it was a double whammy, both on the monetary side and on the supply side, and we just created this problem with inflation that was skyrocketing. I'm surprised we got through it as well as we did. I don't want to harp on the thing, and I don't want to be too difficult in this, but I think that the point is when we look at things like talking about World War III and other stuff, we have to understand that there is an economic component to this, and that our world is starting to wake up to the problem that they helped create. This new world order sounded really nice, but I think Europe is a great example that has started to wake up to the problem. I think they realized that they built their house over the last 50 years out of straw and sticks, and that the big bad wolf, Russia, really wasn't their friend, was he? He really planned to eat them after all. And now I get the impression that a lot of European countries are in a dead run to their brother, the United States' house, which is made out of brick. And you know what? I think Donald Trump's attitude has been one of, well, we'll be happy to sell you bricks, But you need to start building your house out of bricks. And that's, my goodness, if we have to break this down to the three little pigs, the world's in a lot of trouble. We have to get our politicians back on track. And this has always been the case with authoritarian governments. Let me just say this too. When we deal with them and try to bring them into a normal order, they have always backlashed on people. And what's worse is the people who have perpetuated this believe that they are going to introduce the United States into this new world order and Europe and all these things, and we're going to have this global economy. You have to understand, if you allow an authoritarian government, particularly dominated by a country like China or Russia or influenced by them, and you're going to have authoritarian, you're in trouble. They think that they're going to be this new oligarchy. Not at all. It has been proven through time. Stalin, all of them. They kill the useful idiots when they get what they want. So be careful. These people who are drunk on all this money and spending may end up suffering the most from their own devices. So in short, we've come a long way, and I think the real problem is we have spent too much. Inflation was never really the problem. Being the global index was never really the problem. It was allowing too much trade to go overseas and creating a huge trade deficit, which we offset with a budget deficit and we were printing money in that spending with that to help that budget deficit and to put that money out there. And we became drunk on it as a society, and particularly our politicians. We inflated government so big. We've done everything contrary to our founding principles as we became this global monster. And I say that nicely because I'm a very patriotic guy, but we became this huge thing on this world stage of putting money out into the society, and we were killing ourselves. And I just want to kind of follow up. Well, this has been a broad brush view of this. There's a lot of hope in this. We can do a lot of good things. There's a lot of liquidity in the market. And I have no doubt over time, look, the world is becoming a global place, and global trade is important. And the post-World War II model should evolve, and it is. But it needs to evolve at its own pace and in the right way. And it needs to evolve with rational leadership and realistic goals and views that benefit all people. And that's not always possible. It's not always easy. But we can work on that. This is a journey, and we should follow that journey. I think we've become very set on this New World Order end game, and it is not an end game. It is a nightmare. Matter of fact, it is such a nightmare that the Bible talked about it thousands of years ago as part of being, a sign of the rise of evil. So let's make no question, we don't want to do this. This is something that we want to have kind of change, and let's keep it in a free society format and continue this thing. And for those out there who are looking at BRICS can be a threat. It's a disruptor, but BRICS is a joke. BRICS doesn't have the weight or the force to carry the world order, and it doesn't have the ability to do anything except be a disruptor, and that's all it's really meant to be. BRICS is a joke. I mean, we're talking Brazil. I mean, really? I mean, this is like a founding of our new world order? I don't think so. You need a lot more than that to start pressing it. And China, you can talk about China's wealth and its ability to put money out there right now, but China is fed by Western money, Western investment, Western trade. When that valve is turned off, China dies in the vine. And China is already suffering from many countries pulling back on that, and it's already suffering from its own overspending and programs. So the Chinese economy is not in the greatest place right now either. So I think in the world, we need to take a step back and really look at our economics and say, and start benefiting our people again and getting back to really taking care of the things that are important in our priorities, slow some of the spending and shrink the size of government, even if it's painful, and get back to some basics so that we can get back to just being a global trade and start doing an innovative trade where we get out there and do good things for the world. And like I said, I have no doubt that the world will evolve, but we have to be prepared to manage that and do it for the right reasons in the right way. So I don't know, we may do a second segment on this because I went through a lot really fast, and I hope it made a little bit of sense. But we want to make sure that we don't allow this to balloon so big and become unmanageable again. And we want it to benefit the rest of the world, and we want to benefit here at home. And the United States doesn't always have to be the single power in the world, but it will always be an influential power, I think, if it continues as a free society and the great society that it is. So until next time, let's stew on that for a while and think about some of those points and try to absorb it. And maybe we'll do another segment that gets a little more focused and we can talk about it. Thanks for watching.